I'd like to introduce Rick Schaad. We've known each other for over 40 years. And what we're here for today is to hear the story of your family that goes way back into the history of Calaveras County. So welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me today.
So what I'm interested in is to hear where your family originally came from. I know you don't have memories of the first part of your family that came because that was quite a while ago and you're not that old.
My family came from Sobern, Switzerland, Swiss-German descent, and they came to the United States in about 1870, 71, and they stopped in Tennessee. Part of the family stayed there, and then part of the family came on out to California to try their luck at mining. They originally went to Paloma and worked there. My great-grandfather worked there in the mines for a while.
These are gold mines.
In the gold mines.
Mm-hmm.
And he saved his money and he got robbed. So he decided that that was not a good place to be. That's where all the hoodlums were hanging out. And so they headed for the mountains. And so they ended up up above Wilseyville. And they spent the first 2 winters in a one-room cabin with about 6 kids up by Fisher's Ranch, up on Forest Creek. And so they eventually bought property and homesteaded property, and that's where the ranch is today. Mm-hmm. I think they bought 160 acres and then homesteaded additional property to go with that. So that was, I think they were in Wilseyville about 1873 at the ranch. Mm-hmm. And so it was my great-grandfather Augustus and a bunch of kids, and they were pretty self-sufficient.
I'm thinking that back in the day, they were living pretty much a pioneer lifestyle, would you
Mm-hmm.
say?
Mm-hmm. So they started gathering cows and sheep and hogs, and my great-uncles started a sawmill where Schaad's is today, and at the turn of the century, 1900, they were cutting 1 million board feet a year. And so I have a receipt from 1917. They delivered 5,000 board feet of boards to McCallamy Hill for $97. And if you know what lumber goes for today, that was not very much money.
But was it considered a lot back in the day?
Oh, no doubt. That was delivered by buckboard, and it was probably several trips. So so they logged the area, they logged around the ranch, and they were in, the lumber. There was several mills around the area, and they were cutting boards and delivering wood to McCallamy Hill, Jackson, Sutter Creek to build the towns. And they were also cutting timbers and supplying the Argonaut and other mines with timber. And so that was their main thing, was logging at in 1900. I have a census from early 1900s that was around the wealth of the Schaad family and the Sandoz family, and that was about how many cows and pigs you had and how big your woodpile was. And
right.
So, that was a very self-sufficient lifestyle. They grew big gardens, and they, raised all of their own animals, and everybody had chickens and goats and pigs and whatever. And so the meadow at the ranch is where they would mow the meadow, horse-drawn mowing machine, and I've got photos of my grandfather behind a team of horses mowing the meadow, And so that same mowing machine, my dad rode on, and I learned to drive when I was about 12 years old, towing him around the same meadow on the same mowing machine and rake that his father had towed behind a team of horses.
Oh, tell me a little bit more about that. What was that like?
Um,
With the horses, yeah.
well, everything was horse-drawn. I mean, in that period of time, and so it was a lot of, you had work horses, and my dad, grew up on a horse, and they always had cattle, and so he would range the cattle, and at that time there weren't a lot of fences up, so he would range cattle all the way over to Ball Mountain and around the end of Ball Mountain, and it was before anyone lived over there. And so, his dad, my grandfather, Edward, actually raised potatoes. And he had fields and fields of potatoes that he raised out at the ranch. And the early part of the family, 1919 and 1920, the great uncles both perished in the Spanish flu.
Where were they? Were they here?
They were running the sawmill,
Mm-hmm.
and so the Spanish flu took out half of the family, and so there was no longer enough hands to do the sawmill or do do a lot of the work on the ranch. So they started letting parts of the ranch go, and it ended up my grandfather. They disassembled the mill, got rid of the mill, and my grandfather started doing the potatoes because he could do that by himself. Mm-hmm. And then they still had cows and what have you. So
that was a seminal event, really, with the flu coming through like that.
Mm-hmm.
It really changed your family.
It did, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, because there wasn't anyone to work the fields.
Mm-hmm. And if they're working the fields, it was besides the potatoes, what else were they growing?
I would imagine they had a pretty good garden.
Mm-hmm.
There was a lot of fish in the river. My grandmother at one time said that she could throw the frying pan on the stove, and while it was warming, you could run down to the river and catch a mess of fish, and by the time the frying pan is warm, you had 20 fish to throw in it. And so, fish were plentiful, and so that was a biggie then. And that's actually what kind of happened. My grandfather passed in 1937, and at that time there was a lot of people that would come up and camp along the river. And so my grandmother started the campgrounds and started charging people to come in and use the campgrounds, and they would come up and hunting and fishing was the main thing. Mm-hmm. And so when my dad was a kid, he would go out on his horse, and Roy Rogers and Clark Gable used to come up and set up a big camp, and they would go bear hunting, but their horses wouldn't go anywhere near a bear from the smell. And so my dad's horse was pretty well trained, and so when he was a kid, he would go out and drag their bear into camp for them.
Oh, they didn't actually hunt?
They hunted the bear.
Okay.
But their horses wouldn't go anywhere near it, so my dad would have to go out and
get the bear
and bring it in.
Well, that's a story. I've known you all this time, and I didn't know that these people had come up to the area to hunt.
Well, they used to take the bad bears and trap them in Yosemite, mm-hmm. and they would bring them up and release them on Blue Mountain. So it was, there was a lot of people that would come up to that area and just to hunt the bear.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, that's an interesting story. What was it? Did your family, your early ancestors, have Any relationship with the local Miwok people at that
Um,
time?
yeah, my dad was good friends with Harry Wilson and the Wilson family. And my first horse when I was about 5 years old was a Nevada Mustang, and it came from the Miwoks. So we always had horses. My dad had maybe 100 head of cattle, and so we would mow the meadow, rake it, and take the hay in and put it up loose in the barn. The barn was three-sided and it had mangers around three sides, and then you go over there in the wintertime and feed the hay back out to the cows. So he had probably 100 head of cattle when I was young, and grazed them all over the ranch, and then would feed them through the winter. So we always had horses and cows. And
Say your names of your grandfather and grandmother.
Edward and Effie. Effie probably, she had the resort.
She seems very resourceful. I'm sure you have some stories about her.
Yeah, she had the bar. She started the bar, and she had a partner, and they built cabins and opened the campgrounds and built fish ponds, and they built the bar, I think, in probably 1950. And by that time, they already had people coming up to camp on the river and go up. The lake was put in by CPUD in 1939, and they had to make improvements to the road and to the bridge to get the equipment up the hill to build the lake and the reservoir. The lake was taken eminent domain from my great uncle, and that was his property, and actually he had left it to his sister, and she ended up with the property. They took the lake for a public water supply from Colony Hill and San Andres. And so that was in 1939. They built a spillway, and the first year that it was in, it washed out. And so they almost lost the entire dam the first year of operation, so they had to go and build a new spillway in 1940. And so so we used water from the lake to irrigate all the pastures, and we flood irrigated everything. And that's the way my dad had always done it. So all that was in open ditches, and you had to go over and change the water every day and move it along the ditch, and then mow all of the meadows and try to get enough hay to last through the winter.
So the spillway that's there now, when was that put in?
1940.
Oh, that's all that time
That was the
ago.
new one, yeah.
Oh.
So there, if you go to the bottom of the spillway and look up to the right, there's an old spillway. And that was the one that collapsed and washed out the first year.
Well, folks around the area have just always known about Schaad's, and we just call it Schaad's.
Yeah, I don't know how many people have claimed over the years that they caught their first fish at Schaad's.
My son.
Yeah.
I have a picture of it.
So yeah, it was when I was young, probably 6, 7 years old, the road, the Stockton Box Road, went over and across Forest Creek, and there was a log bridge there. And my dad would take me out and set me on the corner of the bridge with a fishing pole, and the limit was 10 fish. So he would walk downstream and he would catch 9, and he'd bring them back and put them in my creel, and then he'd walk upstream and come back with 10 fish, and we had almost 2 limits between us. And so I finally caught my first fish sitting on the bridge in Forest Creek.
Oh, wonderful.
So
So tell me some more about Effie, because she's has some interesting stories, because so many people knew her.
So she started the resort, and so there was a lot of people from the valley that would come up and spend the weekends, and the campgrounds were down the hill from the bar. So they came up and they would drink at the bar and then roll down the hill to their camp. And so she had been a cook in some of the logging camps, and so she was a pretty rugged character, and she didn't put up with an awful lot. And so I remember her chasing people out of the bar with a frying pan and threatening to bonk them on the head. And so it was a pretty going place for a lot of years, probably 50s and 60s. And in my childhood, I remembered, always driving by, and there'd be a group of people there, and they would all be just having a good time. And so she started having a big opening day barbecue and inviting everybody that came up throughout the year to come to the barbecue. And one year, I was about 4 or 5 years old. She hired a gentleman with a big red accordion, and he came out and walked around and played for 300 people that were there. And I just followed him around all day, and that's went home and told my mom I wanted to learn to play the accordion, and so that became my instrument of choice. She came home with a little accordion, and I started taking lessons. So
and you can play the piano as well.
Yeah, well, at least with the right hand. So Effie was always kind of stern, but she had a big heart. And I remember she and my dad didn't ever really get along very well. But I remember we would pick up her newspaper at Mitchell Mill, and my mom drove the school bus. So I would run the newspaper in, and she'd give me a orange soda and a bag of planter peanuts, and you take 3 sips out of the soda, dump the peanuts in, and then try to get them all back out before the soda was gone. But yeah, she was a character. I think probably in the 90s when I went to remodel the bar, it was an old sugar pine bar slab, and there was a divot in the bar, and I realized this divot was where she had sat for about 300 years with her elbow on the bar.
Oh.
And there was an indentation where she sat there and greeted everyone that came in. Mm-hmm. And so she had quite a following of people. And as I look back through the photographs, from when I was a kid, it was such a great idea to have that bar, and everybody, just had a good time, and so it kind of ran its course, and by the 80s, end of the 80s, it was pretty run down, and then I reopened it in about 1995, and it wasn't anything like my memory from childhood. It was really kind of a pain to have people there and plying them with alcohol and expecting them to behave in a particular fashion. Mm-hmm. But I don't know how she did it for so many years, except she loved to be around the people, and she always told stories and always had good people there around her.
Did she have true stories, or did she have tall tales?
Well, both.
Do you remember any of them?
I don't remember a lot of her particular stories. Most of them were from other people outside of the family that, told stories about Effie and how she did different things. And, she lived at the end of our driveway. So she lived about 100 yards from our house. And she always had a dog, and the dog always knew Sunday morning he'd show up at our house ready for the leftover pancakes, maybe a piece of bacon. And so I do remember one of my early memories of her. My sister had rabbits, pet rabbits, and she went off to school one day, and I remember going down to my grandmother's house, and her and my mom were taking care of the rabbits and putting them in the freezer.
Oh.
And it was a little bit traumatic for me at 4 or 5 years old that, not so much that they were putting food in the freezer, but that, those were my sister's pet rabbits.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So, Effie always had a big walk-in freezer locker room, and they'd always hang deer in there, and that was still using venison and being self-sufficient.
Right.
So.
Do you have some pictures you can show us?
I do.
And tell us a little bit about those.
Okay, so I don't know if this one's kind of small, but this was probably one of the last pictures of my grandfather and my grandmother and my dad and my uncle, and they're harvesting the hay in the meadow. And this was in 1937, and that's when my grandfather passed.
Mm-hmm.
So he was in his 50s.
Yeah.
And that is I think a representation. It always reminds me of the picture of the old couple standing with the pitchfork.
Mm-hmm.
They worked hard and, had rugged hands.
Right. Now that's a truck there. Yes?
Yeah. It's a 1937 Ford. So it was probably pretty new right then.
Yeah.
And then here's another picture of, this is my grandfather in on the mowing machine behind the team of horses. And this is the same mowing machine that I would tow my dad around on behind the Jeep. So he had a 52 Willys Jeep that he towed the mowing machine and the rake, and it had steel wheels. And every once in a while I would get it in the wrong gear, and I'd get going too fast, and I'd buck him off of the back, and then I wouldn't necessarily see him till I came around the next lap, and he'd be standing there, and I knew I was in trouble. I knew I was going to be told where first gear was again.
Yes. And you were 12?
And I was 12.
Okay. That's pretty young to take on that responsibility. So, are there any other pictures you have that you might share?
I have a picture of this is a picture of my dad in the middle, my uncle, and my aunt. Mm-hmm. And this was in about 1930 something, probably 37.
And what's that building in the background?
That's an old cabin that was at the ranch,
Mm-hmm.
and it's just recently kind of decomposed into the ground. But my dad was actually born in that cabin.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a midwife and delivered him right in that cabin.
Mm-hmm.
And then I have another picture, and this is a picture of the ranch, looking from an airplane up toward the lake.
Oh, I see that. Right.
And you can see Blue Mountain and the reservoir.
Mm-hmm. Were there some animal stories? I'm thinking about back in the day. I mean, the other night I heard mountain lion calling, very
Mhm.
close. And we had a bear come a year or so ago and take one of our wiener pigs, just took a little Bob in the night. And so we have adventures with animals. I wonder what they were like back in the day.
I remember someone that came up to my grandmother's house and they asked her if they could let their bear dogs out and go track bear. And she told them that they'd never find a bear within 10 miles of civilization. And they let the dogs out, and the dog ran around behind the house and brought a bear up out of the blackberry bushes right behind her house. So, you know, probably most of the stories from out there were around deer hunting, and I used to have an old rifle that they found that someone had missed his shot, and they just swung the rifle and wrapped it around a tree and left it there. And so that was one of the old relics, and that went up to my son's fireplace mantle in Idaho. And so that was an old treasure. You know, most of the stories were around fishing, and you know how fishermen are. So those fish got to be really big.
Yes.
And there was a lot of fish taken out of Schaad Reservoir. There was really good fishing. Probably, I think the biggest fish I saw come out of there was 13.5 pounds, and probably 32, 33 inches long. The reservoir, when they built it, the valve was in the bottom, and it was eventually covered up with debris and silt, so they had to drain the lake. And that lake, when they drained it, I was probably 12, 13, 14 years old, and I'd go up there and there was just huge German browns flopping around in the mud, and it was just you know,
Yeah.
a shame to see that. But she did most of her business around the bar, and she would cook in the little room in the back. She had a little kitchen, and she would cook meals if someone came in and wanted something, and then the campgrounds were always full. So yeah, I think you know, Schaad's Resort was what it was called then, and I tried to bring it back to life in about 1995. I ran it for about 5 years and opened up the campgrounds, and we had events and bands and what have you there. And I think our biggest event, we had the local band from West Point out there one 4th of July, and I think we had 1,000 people show up.
Wow.
So, and then it just was a little bit too much insanity, and we closed the doors.
Now, I think you've been involved with dirt bike racing and some other things with your family. Tell me about that.
So the West Point Timberwolves were established probably in the early 50s, and it was Kenny Noble and you know, a bunch of Kenny's friends and my dad's friends. And so my dad never rode dirt bikes, but he drove the Jeep and the sag wagon behind. And so they started as a club. They would ride from Wilseyville, from the ranch. They would ride over the top of Blue Mountain, and they would go get gas and a cold drink at Dorrington, and then they would ride back to Pioneer and then end up back at the ranch. And so it was probably 40, 50 miles of logging roads, and so it became, you know, soon evolved into, well, the first one to Dorrington, and then the first one to Pioneer, and then the first one back, and then it became about 100-mile hare scrambles loop. And so that was the first race, was a 100-mile loop. And it evolved into a timed event, or a lap event first, where they would race different classes of motorcycles for so many laps. And then it kind of shrunk down onto just the ranch, and then became a hare scrambles, a European style hare scrambles, where now it's a timed event. And we moved it off of the ranch to Lodestar because of parking, and it's a better facility, about 6-7 years ago. But we had national events there that were in January, and one year during the national they had all the tents set up, a little bit of sprinkle on Saturday. It's always in November. So we always had mud and rain, but this event was in January, and on Saturday they had a little bit of rain, and the Sunday morning it had very quietly snowed about 1.5 feet and collapsed all the tents, and nobody knew it until they got up, and so they still had to run the race on Sunday in about a little over 1 foot of snow.
And anyway.
So they ran it anyway. And I have pictures that I show my grandson races, and I show him some of the old pictures of, they've got river crossings that were 3 foot deep, and it was all the way up to the gas tank, and I tell him that's back when real men raced motorcycles. But the races, back in the 60s were there wasn't such a thing as a dirt bike. You took a BSA 650 and put knobbies on it, and it was a big chunk of steel, and you tried to race it. And my dad, on a bad day when it was raining, he could beat the motorcycles around the course with his Jeep. Mm-hmm. And so the motorcycle races, I started riding when I was about 13, and that was, he always showed me this picture, and he says, "There's your backyard. You can go anywhere you want, just don't worry your mother. Be home by dinner." So when I was younger, I had a horse, and the horse was well trained, and I could go out, and if I didn't know where I was at, I'd drop the reins, and he'd take me back to the barn by dinner. And so when I got the motorcycle, it wasn't as well trained as the horse, so I would have to depend upon my own skills to get back home. So growing up as a kid out there, that was a huge backyard, and I just would get lost wandering around in the woods. And growing up, I think people ask me where I grew up, and I said I didn't, because it's overrated. So I still ride motorcycles, and I still go out and play with the grandkids, and I can keep up with 2 of them now, the 8 and the 9-year-old, but the other 2 are gone.
That's quite a long span from the 50s, when the motorcycles were first started, the scramble. Because all those of us who live in the area know there's always this Wilseyville scramble. But the history of it goes farther back than I realized.
Yeah, it was they weren't dirt bikes back then.
Right.
It wasn't until really 1968, 69 when Yamaha came out with an enduro bike, and it was actually a bike you could buy, and it was pretty well suited for the dirt. Mm-hmm. And until then, we had a few of the world-class riders that came over from Sweden, and they were on Husqvarnas, and they just kind of schooled everyone. And everyone, the Wilseyville Hare Scrambles was a really old-time classic race, and so it was people come from all over the world to race that. Mm-hmm. And so it was, back in the day, you always, you could smell the motorcycle, the two-stroke mix, and it just kind of made your heart pump. And that is something that my kids all took on and started doing and riding, and then the grandkids now. So maybe
it's a
that's
family tradition.
my legacy.
If you have to think about a legacy from the first people who came from Switzerland to today, is there some overriding thought or theme or something about your family that you can talk about?
Well, I think what I would probably touch on would be the self-sufficiency. And the self-sufficiency is important to me today, as it was to my ancestors. It's important, that we're able to live a sustainable lifestyle, and it doesn't have anything to do with, it doesn't have much to do with going out and earning money. It means that you have a garden, and you're able to, take from the land and preserve the land. And I'm involved in some forestry operations on the ranch to make it a sustainable forest. And that to me is important. When I grew up, I watched my grandmother, Effie. She would walk up and down Schaad Road in the fall, the late fall, just before a storm. She'd walk up and down the road with a pitchfork full of fire, and she would set the whole hillside on fire. And it would burn up the hill until it burned out, and there was no brush, there was no undergrowth, there was no story, and no ladder fuel, and so it didn't hurt anything. All the big trees that were there were like an old growth forest with no limbs up, 30 feet. And so my grandmother, did that, and then my dad would section off. He had a bulldozer, and he would section off 20 or 30 acres at a time in the winter and burn it. And by the 70s, that became taboo to do prescribed burn and do open burning like that. And so he quit doing it, and so the forest became very overgrown. And so the last couple of years I've been clearing and brushing and burning and masticating now, mechanical mastication, and going through a CAL FIRE program to bring the forest back around to a sustainable forest. In those days you had low intensity fires. You left a fire out in the forest and it had flames that were 1.5 feet high, and it burnt through and it didn't hurt anything. It did more, far more good than damage. And now the fires that we have are high intensity. And so probably, the sustainable forest and the self-sufficiency are high in my playbook because of the way the family always sustained itself there. And, they were able to live their lifestyle regardless of what was going on in the outside world.
Right. So any other stories, any other things that you recall that's part of your family?
My mom was she worked at the hospital in San Andres, and when I went into kindergarten, she was going to drive school bus for a year, and she retired after 27 years. And so she was always driving the school bus, and I'd be the first one on the school bus at 6:30 in the morning and the last one off at 6:30 at night. And probably a lot of stories about her bus driving, and kids that were consistently late for the bus, and she would drive down their driveway and to pick them up to embarrass them, and then she'd turn around and get stuck. And that was the Davis kids in Wilseyville. But back then, probably my mother, she didn't ask for respect, she demanded it. And when you misbehaved on the school bus, she stopped the bus and no matter where it was at, you were off the bus. And, you know, it's a different time and period, different way of dealing with kids and, you know.
She sounds a bit like Effie.
Mm-hmm, probably so. So I was the youngest of 6 kids, and when I came along, she didn't maybe have a lot of tolerance, so it was, you know, it was important to be seen and not heard.
Mm-hmm. So you're the youngest,
Mm-hmm.
and you've stayed here. Not everyone in the family has stayed
Right.
in Calaveras County. So what kept you here?
That's a good question. That, I mean, I did make it all the way to Glencoe,
Well,
and I just always had a love of the land and a love of the area.
perhaps it's
And-
how you grew up, from riding horses and working really in the old way
Mhm.
on the ranch that maybe kept you here. But I know you worked in construction.
I moved around in construction.
Mhm.
You know, the property, the ties with the property are, at times they're deep roots,
Mhm.
and at times it's an anchor. And so, you know, depending on which day it is, it changes. And it's, I traveled, I tended to do a lot of log work. So my love was working with big timbers and logs. And so I traveled around, and that's where I think I met your husband, where I met Ted, really was going and doing rammed earth homes and we did the log and timber work, and he was stacking the dirt up in neat piles. And so, you know, to do that kind of work, you had to travel where the work was.
Mhm.
And so I've worked in Yosemite Park and on Log Lodge down there, and did another log lodge up in Silver Lake, and then worked for a couple of years for David over in Napa.
Mhm.
And I always found that was my love, was the big timber.
Mhm. Mhm. So you have a new plan for the ranch now. Tell us about that.
We do. I could give you the business plan from yesterday, but it's obsolete. It is changing very rapidly, and we've had so many things that have just fallen into place for us. Denise and I both do a lot to try to maintain our health, eating healthy and exercising, and the healing that we have both had from the property is something that we would like to share. We feel like the property has a very special effect on people, and it certainly has for both Denise and I. And so we're trying to open it up as a wellness center, which is far better than it being a bar and restaurant. So we're working on developing a business plan for a wellness center and doing yurts and glamping and trying to take people back in time, take people down by the river, turn the phone off, turn the internet off, get them away from their laptop and away from the everyday hustle and bustle, and get them to sit by the river or to share a meal or just sit. And so we'll have meditation classes, yoga. Denise is going to do some art classes, and I will probably lead the nature walk. And so we're trying to establish our funding to put that piece together, as well as trying to decipher whether it's our own love of the land that's driving us, or whether we really have something there that would attract people and it's a long ways up there. So what we're trying to do is establish something that's very memorable for people to want to come back and go home and tell their friends about it and come back again.
I think that kind of answers the question I asked about why you've stayed, and I think it's the land.
Well, it's...
Because it's just wonderful to be out where you live, and to have that, it answers that question, that it's deep within you, that you know that this is a special place.
Well, I think that what happens is we look at the grandkids and we wonder what kind of world it's going to be for their grandkids. And, you know, we can complain about it, or we can sell and move to Idaho like everyone else, or we can stick around and try to make the world a better place.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I think that's a good ambition.
So that's what drives me.
Mm-hmm. Because you've done other things that I think have guided you. You've done life coaching.
Mm-hmm.
You've done some other things that kind of exhibit your sense of sharing and giving back to other people. It's part of your strength, which I think is a family inheritance.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that, you know, I think every step of the way it aims you toward, you know, growing your soul. And so everything that I've done in my lifetime, you know, I think the key is knowing when to exit and get out. You know, the construction industry was, you know, I enjoyed that. I enjoyed working with people and worked very closely with them. And from that I learned how to help people materialize their dreams and build their dream home. And so life coaching seemed to be the same thing with different clothes on. And so, you know, trying to show people, hold people in their greatness, whether they see it or not. Mm-hmm. And so that's, you know, my construction background kind of filtered into the life coaching. And, you know, this is a project that we're taking on now that, you know, it's very big. Mm-hmm. And I'm going, what am I doing this at my age? So, you know, it's probably more, I feel like it's an accumulation of everything that I've done in my life. And Denise as well, because she went through physical fitness and had the studio in Jackson, and she learned from watching people's physical body. She would read them, and then she became intuitive about what they had going on, so she became more interested in reading their energy and seeing what their energy was and where they had blockages in the physical body. And so, you know, that's probably a whole nother story, but that's what brought us to trying to create the Wellness Center and helping people release that emotion and release that energy.
Right, right. Could you share the picture of thinking forward about what you're doing to establish a wellness place, and also your grandchildren? You have a great picture there.
So
in a way it's for them.
This was taken at a log lodge that I built it's right below Shot Rock on Highway 88. It's in between Silver Lake and Bear River Reservoir. And I built the lodge about 20 years ago, and it became a wedding venue. And so my stepdaughter decided she wanted to get married there. And she asked me to play the accordion and play her down the aisle, and then turn my hat around and perform the service and marry her. So this is kind of like a highlight reel of where I was at, you know, 20 years ago, doing the building the place, and then these are all 10 of the grandkids at the wedding that was 3 years ago.
Mm-hmm. I think it's wonderful to have all of that history about your family, and for us to see that it's still alive and strong.
It is. very much so. So we have a granddaughter that just graduated from Chico, and another granddaughter that's interesting. She's a nursing student in Flagstaff, and she's doing rotations onto the reservation and learning to heal people from a spiritual side. It's different than most medical books. So another granddaughter that just got married, and I think she's going to be the first to make us great-grandparents. So
dear.
I don't know if I'm ready for that. I have to teach another one to ride a motorcycle.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, so we have a ballet dancer and a world-class swimmer, and 4 of them that ride dirt bikes, and you know, that's the legacy. That's the legacy, is the kids, and you know, part of our wellness center is to just try to improve upon things and help them find a better way in the world.
Well, thank you, Rick,
Thank you.
for sharing your family story. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.